Welcome to AI, Government and the Future, a podcast by Corner Alliance. We explore the intersection of artificial intelligence, government and the future. We work with government to create results. We ignite your agency's mission by helping you to design and implement high-impact and innovative federal programs in AI, broadband, cybersecurity, public safety, and more. Being a government ally is at the core of all we do.
Welcome to a special edition of AI Government in the Future, where we are taking a look back at some of the most insightful and thought-provoking discussions we've had with our expert guests on the transformative potential of artificial intelligence. In this episode, we've compiled highlights from our previous guests, each offering unique perspectives on how AI is revolutionizing various industries and sectors. As we listen back to these excerpts, you'll gain a comprehensive understanding of the AI landscape, from the way we interact with technology to the implications for governance and the future of work. Our guests will share their insights on the opportunities and challenges presented by AI and how we can navigate this rapidly growing field. We are joined by Alex Fink, a remarkable entrepreneur and thought leader in the AI industry. Alex is the founder and CEO of Otherweb, a groundbreaking platform that leverages AI to enhance the quality of information consumed online. Alex has hosted insightful conversations on the Otherweb podcast, delving into the media landscape and the broader information ecosystem. For the moment, I think getting into the sort of bias and misinformation risk that AI-generated content presents. First question there, how prevalent do you think that this is? I mean, when we're consuming content from the internet these days, what percentage do you think is AI generated at this point?
It depends on what exact content you're talking about. So if you go to the New York Times, probably zero. If you go to a random result in your Google search results when you search for something, much more than zero. And if you go to websites that specifically exist for SEO purposes to basically sell backlinks or monetize traffic, then in some cases it's pretty close to 100%. There's an interesting personal story here, which is I used to be the VP engineering of a VR camera company called Aura. And at some point, I accidentally opened the website that used to be that company's websites, where I used to see our VR broadcasting camera. And I suddenly see there's 300 articles or so here, all written by the same person on the same day. And I go to one of the SEO marketplaces where you can buy a backlink, and I search for aura.co, which is the URL of that website. And I see that I can buy a backlink for $80. They would write an article, post it on aura.co, backlinking to whatever I want them to backlink to. So this happens a lot. These companies buy domains that used to be real, that used to stand for something, whether the company went bankrupt or a person just decided to retire and is no longer using that domain still has good reputation with Moz, with Ahrefs, with all of these services, right? And likely with Google. So they buy them up and they start using AI to generate a lot of content to post there. And then they start monetizing it through ads or by selling backlinks.
It's a very intense dynamic. We're seeing it at all sorts of different places, even in government consulting. That sort of stuff comes up now. And we have a lot of clientele that get very concerned around misinformation, that sort of thing. What sort of techniques have you seen that are out there trying to combat these kind of techniques that are having this rapid AI proliferation?
The first thing I would say is misinformation existed before AI. AI simply makes it worse in some sense. It makes content cheaper to create, all the way to zero potentially. So that is the risk there. But if you look already at the landscape, I see a lot of vague definitions of misinformation and things getting mixed together, right? There's the old concept of disinformation, which is information created to deceive on purpose, right? That has existed before. It exists now. It probably hasn't been increasing all that much over the past few decades, but now because videos and audios can be faked, you're going to see maybe more persuasive disinformation. Perhaps not more of it, but it will be more persuasive. That's one risk of AI. Now, if you look at misinformation or malinformation, right? Misinformation being something that gives you something untrue, but not with the intent to deceive you, probably with the intent to monetize you, right? and malinformation being something that gives you something true, but partial that leads you to the wrong conclusion, right? Those are kind of the more vaguely defined categories in the way most people talk about them. There, you're just going to see a much larger quantity because now it's cheaper to create. So why not flood the zone if you're monetizing things with ads anyway, right? If BuzzFeed used to hire journalists and tell them your quota is 15 articles per day, now that quota is going to be 500 or 1,000 for whatever replaces BuzzFeed, because BuzzFeed's out of the news business, right? And I see entire websites that are created to look like legitimate websites. If your listeners want to check one live, do nybreaking.com, like New York Breaking, right? And you will see a whole bunch of articles that are just scraped from MSN and other sources with a few word substitutions. And if you look at the About page, you will see it's created by an ad agency that is just monetizing the traffic. Right? And so there's a lot of these, but the stuff they are scraping might be false. And in that case, if they are rewording it, they're just creating a higher volume of that falsehood.
So if you had the responsibility as a job of moderating content for a platform like this, and you were trying to minimize AI generated content, what sort of tools would you be looking at? What sort of techniques and tactics would you be using to do your best to try to at least provide transparency to say, this was AI content, this was written by a human being?
Okay, so it just so happens that I run a platform that actually curates and moderates content, and that's what we do. But I can tell you we are not focused on AI generated versus not AI generated as a primary parameter. I think the much better approach is to look at the content and try to figure out if it's good. Who created it is secondary, right? You see organizations like NewsGuard try to do this spreadsheet level filtering of saying this outlet is good, this outlet is bad. But what we see when we just plot the scores of every article coming from the same outlet is that there's a distribution within each outlet. And for some outlets, you see much more variance than for others. Right? New York Times, most articles are roughly the same quality. But Washington Examiner, the news is great. The editorials are crap. Right? And so you see much wider distribution of the quality of content. And when you add AI to the fore, then yes, you're going to get even more distribution potentially, more crap, but more great stuff. So why filter based on who created it when we could just look at the language itself and figure out this seems to use informative factual language, good references, always citing their sources, everything is laid out in a coherent manner, doesn't make any claims it cannot substantiate. That's a good article. Or you look at another article, this uses all adjectives, all adverbs, everything is superlative, no links to anything except your own article from yesterday. This is a bad article, right? And we can just do that and we ignore the source.
This maybe is a bit extreme then, but are there any sort of legal frameworks or legal concepts that would potentially try to step in like a regulatory capacity? I understand that's your business model. But if you were doing something like election politics, you could understand a potential regulator stepping in and saying, no, we have to actually provide some sort of validation, transparency mechanism, something like that to give people peace of mind that what they're reading or viewing they can rely on. Have you encountered anything like that?
There's a lot of discussions about that happening, but as somebody who was born in the Soviet Union, I'm a little concerned about the idea that a government regulator is going to come in and say this is true and this is not true. Because ultimately, I grew up in a society where everything people believed was untrue because government said so. Right? And so I think that is the end state of regulators trying to determine what is true and what is untrue directly. Now, there's indirect approaches, which some might say are less concerning, some might say are more concerning, like that office the FBI had in San Francisco with 80 agents in it, basically sending takedown requests to social media for anything they considered misinformation. And that is also quite concerning. That's not direct government censorship, but to the extent that you want this to happen, you probably don't want FBI agents doing this, right? You probably want somebody hired based on a different set of criteria to do the job of takedown requests on social media. So what government can do is potentially help set the standards, right? And then let let people do what they do, government could also try to affect the incentives in some way. Because one of the biggest problems we have right now in the information ecosystem is that almost everything is monetized through ads. Ads pay per click or per view. There is no pay per quality or pay per truth. As long as that is the case, everything is going to drift towards clickbait. And if clickbait is also super cheap to create, you see where that leads, right? So government can think of ways to try to affect the incentives, maybe try to nudge ad networks towards, let's say, making the payout dependent on the content quality, right? So the same click on the same ad might pay more if the quality of the underlying page is high versus if it was low. Maybe that's a role for government to play. Maybe government can play a role in making sure that it's easier for consumers to switch from a bad platform to a good platform. Because right now, most platforms out there, the Facebooks, the Twitters of the world, they make it really hard to leave. You cannot take your data, you cannot take your connection graph with you, etc. So if government mandated something like interoperability between these systems, and if it mandated that you own your data as a user of those systems, right, then the moment a system becomes primarily misinforming, the way Facebook became in 2016, where we actually have stats that it had more shares of misinformation than shares of real information, right? At that point, people can punish that platform by leaving it, and maybe then it will have to correct its behavior because now there's a negative consequence to allowing the spread of too much misinformation on your system. Right? So that's a role that government can play without the heavy-handed thing that leads to what I've experienced in the first 6 years of my life.
We are privileged to welcome Irina Buzu, who's joining us from Moldova, where she is an advisor on AI to the Deputy Prime Minister of Moldova. She has a wealth of knowledge and experience, particularly in algorithmic decision-making, ethics, and public policy. It's at the forefront of understanding how AI technologies shape and are shaped by government actions that are going to change our digital policies. So when you think about, say, like, I don't know, like a website like Amazon.com, right? They can use AI to adjust their page in microseconds beyond anything, with no human pushing any button, right? And then it'll completely optimize for the shopper experience or, something like that. And it's just hard to imagine government allowing AI to make these kind of micro adjustments without some huge, I mean, here, like if you want to ask people questions, you got to go through like a 3 to 6 month process where your questions are reviewed by the White House, Office of Management and Budget. How are we going to do this in this world where we're, in one area of your life, you're seeing a page updated in microseconds, and in another area, it's 3 to 6 months. That just doesn't seem like it's going to compute.
Of course, I think it kind of goes back to the issue of control, because governments and authorities, of course, they love to have control over the entire process, whatever the process is that has to do with government affairs. And then you have, in the case of AI, you would have to delegate part of that authority and part of that autonomy to a system that is completely artificial, that you cannot completely entirely explain. And then for people who are used to having a control over the entire loop of the process, I believe it's very hard to just kind of take their hands off the reins for a second and to delegate even the tiniest task to something that is automated. Because at the end of the day, it also comes back to the responsibility and the liability for failure. And then if you have a person in the loop, then sure, you can point to someone specific and say, like, you're at fault, like you will pay the consequences. But when you have an artificial system, what do? Do you like decommission the system? Do you destroy it? Like, how does that balance the impact that the failure has had on, for example, a person versus the punishment that an artificial system takes on?
Wow. So you really don't want to be the human in the loop because you're the one that gets blamed, right? So everyone's going to be like, I'm not the human in the loop.
Yeah.
She is. So this strikes me as like a fundamental issue for using AI in public policy. That, I was talking yesterday with somebody who was kind of talking about how humans, like our wetware, we're very tribal and local, and technology is global, and it doesn't have those kind of things built into it unless we build them in. So this seems like another place where government is just fundamentally set up in a way that, at least at scale, something like AI is going to be very difficult for them to adjust to.
Yeah, but I think when it comes to embedding AI in government processes and government affairs, we really need to kind of showcase a good practice, or maybe like even a small one, where you have an algorithm that takes on part of the responsibility and the task of a government employee and delivers them properly, to kind of lead by example and to convince top management in the government that it can actually be useful. I was reading online that, for example, in Korea, there is a corporation that has an AI as a board member for the corporation. Sure, it doesn't have any necessary rights within the corporation, any voting rights, but it looks more like a PR stunt. But it's interesting to kind of look into that into the future to see how maybe we can balance responsibility with artificial systems that way.
Oh, it's an interesting idea. There's Jeff Bezos. Sorry, I'm on the Amazon kick today, I guess. But he would always have an empty chair at the board table saying that represented the customer. And now you could actually have like an artificial avatar, right? That was like, I'm the customer and here's how I react, right? That's kind of a cool idea, like having avatars representing different kind of stakeholders. In some ways, you could have like a policy debate between these avatars and kind of figure out the parameters of the policy.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that you don't have just AI as decision makers there. Like you have a lot of people and some artificial actors, and then the collective responsibility is still collective. So you still have the humans in the loop. So it's interesting to see how that also balances out the risks of having someone artificially deciding on various policies and whatever happens.
Yeah, the other thing I see as an issue with the government side is like, what if AI tells us something that we don't like? So what if it tells us like the way to solve child welfare is to like do something that we don't want to do, right? And what if it's right? I think it's probably going to be an input to obviously the policy process, but I think we're still going to be subject to all these sort of human biases and feelings that aren't optimal decisions, right?
Sure. I think the first test that we're doing on that is like using GPT and other generative AI, like nowadays. We have all of this text input that we get from generative AI, but then it's up to you to decide whether you want to use that text or not. I'm a strong believer that the final decision has to stand with the humans. But the process of deciding can be enhanced by AI agents.
Like AI can tell me that I need to eat less to lose weight, but I'm still not going to do that, right? So I guess that's true about a lot of things. We've had this problem before, right? So talk to me a little bit about, we talked a little bit about bias and how are governments looking at this? Like, is it about getting additional data sets? Is it about building in specific rules? How do you see people approaching this issue of bias?
It's a complex question, really, when you think about mitigating bias. We've talked a bit about the technical strategies, but it also has to involve, the policy measures. And here's where the government comes in play. So I feel that governments need to develop very clear ethical guidelines and principles for AI development and deployment and use. And those principles need to emphasize fairness and non-discrimination, accountability, as we said before. Also, we need to, as governments, implement very transparent procurement processes for AI systems. And that would mean that they would require, for example, vendors to demonstrate fairness and bias mitigation measures. Also, it's important to establish, say, some sort of independent auditing and evaluation mechanisms that would regularly assess AI systems for bias and ensure compliance with ethical guidelines and considerations. We also need to ensure that there is public engagement and feedback. And here's where awareness campaigns come very, very handy, because we need to engage the public and the stakeholders to gather feedback on AI systems to identify, for example, potential biases. Why not? Because at the end of the day, the public being the developer, but also the end user of any sort of AI-related product, we need to have people educated and literate enough for them to be be able to understand what those risks and what the biases are and how to mitigate those as well. And at the end of the day, it all comes back to monitoring, continuous monitoring and improvement, because ongoing monitoring and improvement processes that would continuously evaluate AI systems for bias, that we wouldn't be able really to implement any corrective measures as needed. So yeah, I guess in this whole ecosystem, you need to have those regulatory bodies, as much as we don't like them. We need to have data governance frameworks. We need regular impact assessments. We need public reporting and accountability. And we need continuous training and education that would provide all the necessary information to the large public, again, and educate them on all the potential risks but also benefits of AI.
Yeah, I mean, the bias issue, I think, is going to move right into the culture wars of the United States issues. So, I think that we already fight over biology and different kinds of, is this real? Is this inherent? Is this? So in some ways, the bias debate is going to come down to, no, I think that's bias because I don't believe that. And someone else says, well, that's factual. And, it seems to me that there's no way for AI to escape being a political football, and that it's basically happening. Hopefully in Moldova, it's not as big a deal as it is here, but I think it's inevitable. That'll play out in the public sector.
In Moldova, we don't have a mature enough AI ecosystem. So to see how AI can replicate biases, it's a bit premature, I feel. But we do have a lot of other biases, societal biases and political biases and economic biases and welfare biases, whatever you want here. And I guess, again, it comes back to a lot of education, because with AI, it's the same as with digitalization, digital transformation. Sometimes you don't need to digital transform every single process if the solution for an issue can be made in an analogous environment. Because otherwise you have a problem in an analog that is not resolved in an analogous manner, and you just transform it to the digital realm. It's going to perpetuate the same problem, but digitally. So maybe sometimes when you think about biases, it's not that an AI is at fault for perpetuating a societal bias, but maybe you have to think about how do you solve this issue in a non-online environment, and how can you build policies for people to feel safe, for people to feel secure, for them not to feel discriminated, for the state to create an ecosystem for the people to live in fairness.
We are joined by Jonathan Gillham, a visionary entrepreneur and trailblazer in the AI and content verification space. John is the founder of Originality.ai, a cutting-edge platform that helps content marketers, writers, and publishers ensure the integrity of their work in a world where generative AI is reshaping the way we create and consume content. With a wealth of experience in AI detection and marketing solutions, John is at the forefront of tackling the issues posed by advanced language models and their impacts on our information landscape. Can you give us a sense of why is it important that we're able to identify organic versus AI-generated content?
Depends on the use case. I think societally, there's an importance around misinformation. Half the world's population is exposed to an election year this year. The ability to create misleading information at scale is something that the world has never seen, and we now need to wrestle with. And so I think that's societally important reasons. And then you can get into some really topic-specific reasons, like within academia, to be able to use assigned writing as an educational instrument, there needs to be some understanding on whether or not a human wrote it or an AI wrote it. And then the world that we sort of focus on, which is website publishing, publishers both want to know that they are getting a fair deal. If they're paying a writer $100 for an article, they don't want to know that just got copied and pasted of ChatGPT in 5 seconds. And then they're also very afraid that Google is taking aggressive stances against AI spam, and if their content is nothing but AI, they will be wrapped up in potential updates and collateral damage.
So do you think requiring AI companies to identify if AI was used in the production of content, do you think that's the right approach?
I don't think so. But I think the reason why it's not is because there's certainly in text, the ability to defeat watermarking schemes will be fairly simple. And so I think putting in a defensive mechanism that will be easily overcome is probably not worth the sort of regulatory administration of that. In the case of images and video, where the societal harm to a single image is more significant, or a single video is more significant than the societal harm based off a single kind of piece of text. I think in those cases, the requirements, or at least sort of the best efforts to be able to declare if that was created, makes more sense.
Do you think that there are, sort of standards or regulatory process that would bring that about, or is that something? Is there another approach that you think would be more effective?
OpenAI has certainly recently come out with their efforts around trying to communicate what they're going to be doing from an image generation and image authenticity. And I think there will never be a scenario where it is perfect. And any classifier will always be. I think we're at a state where there will be no sort of binary, provable, this is AI generated or this is human generated. I think we're in a state where we will always need to understand there's a probability this was AI generated and there's a probability it was human generated. But it will be impossible to be in a state where we know with absolute certainty of the true authenticity of a piece of media.
So, sort of acknowledging that AI detection is pretty crucial then, what sort of complementary strategies do you think businesses and creators should use to enhance the quality and authenticity of their work?
We focus on text. That's sort of the world that we think about the most. We don't have an image or video detector. Similar technological sort of concepts in terms of being able to build a classifier that tells the difference between synthetic or human content. In the case of text, what can people do? To exactly your question, has sort of help ensure that the content is human generated, what they want, meets their specifications. Building a relationship with a writer over a period of time and having it be a less transactional experience where writers just churn through content. And similarly with students, where if they're part of the journey and they understand the outcome is increased knowledge and not necessarily the grade, which I know is really hard for students. But understanding that content is part of a longer journey is I think sort of step one. Aligning expectations around what is allowed and what is not allowed is step two. And then step three is putting a control in place like originality to say whether or not there's a probability that content was AI or not AI. And if there is potentially a false positive, which can happen about 2-3% of the time, where a detector will say incorrectly that we think this content is AI, even though it was written by a human, having other mechanisms in place to be able to visualize the creation process. So we have a free Chrome extension. So if somebody writes the document in Google Chrome, there's a bunch of metadata behind around every one of those revisions that has occurred that can be visualized. And then kind of between the relationship, the overall understanding of the goal, the relationship, the alignment around the procedure, the control within a detector, and then a sort of a fail-safe around, okay, maybe this was a false positive. Let's visualize the creation process, but hopefully produce a fairly trusted environment for everyone to be operating without anyone getting falsely accused or ripped off by writers using AI.
Gotcha. That sounds like a very novel utility to try to really help people out in this circumstance. Can you talk a little bit about where that might interface with things like maintaining SEO and not having your results filtered out by some of the AI stuff that Google's trying to do?
Google's in a really tricky spot. The company, sort of Alphabet, Google needs to be this AI forward, leading the charge on generative AI company. Yet if their search results, which is sort of their cash cow is their search results, and if those search results are nothing but AI filled content, why would people go to the search results? Why wouldn't they just go to the AI? And so I think it's a real existential threat to Google, and Google is needed to fight that. What we're seeing from studies that we've done is that up to 13% of search results are AI generated. Google is fighting back against that. Attacking, at one point, de-indexing on March 5th, they did a manual action that de-indexed up to 2% of content sites. Most of those sites that were de-indexed, most of their content was AI generated. And that is sort of their attempts to fight back against AI spam. And one of my sayings right now that I like is that not all AI content is spam, but pretty confident that all spam right now on the internet has been AI generated. Because why wouldn't it be if that's what you're So with that update, it was sad. There were some people that contacted Originality to understand, why did we get wrapped up in this update? And so our writers didn't use AI. How did you know? And then we ran it through our detector, and I mean, we do get false positives, but not the rate that we saw. They were very clearly, their writers had at one point flipped from writing it themselves to spamming that website with AI content, and they got wrapped up. So yeah, I think it's a threat. I think it's a risk to publish AI generated content on your website. Google is needing to combat it, and putting controls in place to accept the risk when it makes sense is critical for most website publishers.
AI, Government and the Future is brought to you by Corner Alliance. To find out more about Corner Alliance and how we work with government to create results, visit our website at corneralliance.com. And then make sure to search for AI Government Future in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. And click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at Corner Alliance, thanks for listening.